In Robert Charles Dallas's 1803 History of the Maroons, Dallas described a group of collaborators on the move. Dallas referred to three groups of people: the Maroons of Trelawneytown, who had been exiled from Jamaica to Nova Scotia in 1796 after the Second Maroon War; the Nova Scotians, or Black Loyalists, who had allied with the British during the American War for Independence, said to be in insurrection at this moment in 1800 that Dallas described; and the White Sierra Leone Council, whom Dallas referred to as the Company. Scholarship on the Trelawneytown Maroons fits into four broader categories of work on Black colonists on the move. The first of these categories includes studies of Jamaican Maroons in Jamaica, Nova Scotia, and Sierra Leone, the treaties that ended the First and Second Maroon Wars, and ethnographies of Jamaican Maroons. The second, third, and fourth categories encompass histories of Nova Scotians, also known as Black Loyalists, and their land problems, comparisons of the Freetown colony to other colonies, and works on migration and the Revolutionary Atlantic. In the context of these works, scholars conventionally recognize three treaties between Jamaican Maroons and the British: the two 1738-39 Leeward and Windward treaties that ended the First Maroon War, and the agreement that concluded the Second Maroon War in 1796. Historians largely concur that the Maroons often furthered imperial aims rather than seeking common cause with other people of African descent. Few of them, however, have questioned the speed with which the Maroons agreed to act on the Sierra Leone Council's behalf in 1800. This presentation argues that the 1800 negotiations between the Sierra Leone Council and the Maroons who relocated from Halifax should be recognized as a fourth formal treaty. Dallas's history telescoped the time between the ship's arrival on the rocky coast of Freetown and the Maroons' decision to assist the Council. The longer negotiations that led to the treaty acknowledged the Maroons as collaborators willing to defend Freetown from foreign invasion, at the same time that they allowed the Maroons to claim broader rights for their resettlement, which they based on their experiences in the Caribbean and North America. To make this argument, this paper compares several of the treaty's key terms, the context in which it was prepared, and the reasons why it has gone unacknowledged. The Maroons that I am discussing today had lived in Jamaica in 1796, when their participation in the Second Maroon War sent them to Halifax. Under a secret article of the terms of this third treaty between Maroons and white Jamaicans, British General George Walpole promised that the Jamaican government would allow the Maroons to remain in the colony. One group of combatants, the Trelawneytown Maroons, capitulated, and Alexander Lindsay, Earl of Balcarres, broke Walpole's promise. The Jamaican Assembly exiled 568 Maroons, 401 old men, women, and children, and 167 men able to bear arms to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they lived until 1800. In Nova Scotia, the British government failed to make adequate plans for provisioning the Maroons, who struggled in a climate much more hostile than any they had previously known, and they explicitly refused to farm even when they managed to obtain land. It was in an undated petition circa January 1799 that the Maroon captains John Jarrett, Andrew Smith, James Barrell, James Lawrence, Thomas Johnson, and Charles Shaw made their most famous assertion on behalf of the other Maroons, quote, that the soil of Nova Scotia will never answer to transplant Maroons in, nor will they ever thrive where the pineapple does not. They linked their happiness to a delicious tropical fruit and argued that its failure to prosper mirrored their own. In response to these complaints, white officials began to withhold rations, discredited accounts of Maroon hunger, and questioned the legitimacy of their petitions. Ultimately, however, the Maroons secured transfer of the colony. They sailed to Freetown, Sierra Leone with better negotiating abilities and arrived at a moment when they would have more leverage than ever before. The Nova Scotians had been clashing with both the Koya Temne and with the Sierra Leone Council, and were engaged in the 1800 insurrection that Dallas described. At least 4 parties had been involved in the planning for resettlement: the Duke of Portland, John Wentworth, the Sierra Leone Company, and the Sierra Leone Council. Planners discussed provisioning for the voyage, and for settlement, they discussed shelter, land allocations, and provisions disbursements. Correspondents also fixated on the Maroons' acceptance of these terms. A letter from leading abolitionist Henry Thornton in February 1800 described a letter that he had received from George Ross, white superintendent of the Maroons, dated 20th December 1799, which promised that the Maroons were ready to consent to the terms. By August 1800, however, it had become clear that although the Maroons had amply and before many witnesses acceded to the terms verbally, they would not agree to sign them. This is the context under which they arrived in Freetown on September 30th, 1800. The following morning, on October 1st, Ross informed the Maroons, quote, of the unpleasant state of the colony. He explained that they received the news with, quote, a cheerful countenance and repetitions of their assurances that the greatest candor had always been shown them and that the greatest fairness was intended them. On October 2nd, Ross introduced Maroons named Montague, Johnson, Bailey, Smith, Palmer, and Charles Shaw to Freetown's governor, Governor Ludlam. Council minutes record that this day was important because it marked the date when the Maroons' public assent to the terms were required. According to George Ross's journal, at the end of this speech and Montague's reply that the Maroons were willing to help deal with the riot, the governor then read over the terms to them, and they agreed to them as when in Halifax. But their agreement was not as immediate as Ross or Dallas would have us think. Governor Ludlam read the 1800 articles to the Maroons twice over, explaining each article as he went. It was only after the Maroons asked for alterations to the agreement and were granted them that they acquiesced. Several scholars' writings have informed my interpretation of these negotiations as a treaty document. Jenny Benham, a historian of law and diplomacy whose expertise stretches from the medieval period to the modern era, has argued for a more expansive definition of treaties. Her work reminds us that they were characterized by questions about who held the upper hand during negotiations and the ceremonies and rituals that accompanied them. She points out that although international law defines a treaty as an agreement between states, that definition is too limited for the medieval period, and I would extend that point to the 18th and 19th centuries. Scholars working in Native American and Indigenous studies, who have also worked extensively on treaties, have emphasized the importance of reading textual documents against the grain, considering the actions of these peoples in addition to accounts about them, and in some cases even moving beyond textual sources entirely. In his work on Black Baptists, John Sallant has underscored the need to work with brief manuscript fragments, to compare them with other authors, and to contextualize them with other words that emerge during contemporary periods. My interpretation of this document embraces Benham's call for expansiveness. It draws on NAIS methods by performing a close reading of the 2nd, 7th, and 8th articles of the 1800 agreement, because these are the ones that the Maroons negotiated. It also attempts to undertake the comparisons that Sallant calls for, while acknowledging that doing so is more challenging because there were multiple Maroon treaties which varied according to the Maroon polity involved. Here then is the document read to the Maroons on October 2nd, 1800, but dated October 1799. I will show you originals here. And then I will also include the full text that I've transcribed in the next slide in case you pause to read through the articles yourself. In the spirit of following Sallant's example, I would like to make some observations about other Maroon treaties that help to analyze the themes of food, land, labor, foreign defense, slavery, and gender in the 1800 document. The Leeward Treaty of 1738-9 had 15 articles, and the Windward Treaty of 1739 had 14. Of the articles in the Leeward Treaty, 3 related to land, 1 to food, and 2 to foreign defense or slavery. In the Windward Treaty, 2 articles dealt with land, 4 with food, and 3 with foreign defense or slavery. 1 out of the 3 articles to the treaty ending the Second Maroon War in 1796 dealt with land. By comparison of the 12 articles in this 1800 agreement, a full 9 addressed land, the first through 6 articles, and 3 food, articles 3, 7, and 10. In addition to the similarities between this document and the previous Maroon treaties is the fact that the Maroons tried and succeeded in altering the terms of the 1800 agreement. When the Sierra Leone Council members met with the Maroons on October 2nd, the Maroons made 3 and possibly 4 changes to the terms offered. First, they declined, as they had done at Halifax, to sign. They justified this refusal based on the injury they had sustained in Jamaica by the breach of a treaty which eventually led to their exile. They had determined never again, quote, to put their hands to any public paper in future. The council member describing their refusal had originally written simply any paper. The word public had been inserted. So in addition to casting this as an official public document, he also changed something else. Originally, he wrote that the council had thought it, quote, prudent to insist upon a point rather formal than essential. The edit was to find this decision not prudent. In other words, the council agreed that the Maroons did not need to sign the terms because, quote, if insisted upon, it would sour their minds and indispose them to render those services which were so much wanted. The council approached this meeting in a weak bargaining position vis-a-vis the Nova Scotian riot, and the Maroons did the same by treating the document as a sacred object too valuable to be profaned by a signature the council could violate. Second was possibly a trifling alteration made to the second article by the Maroon captain named Bailey. George Ross is the only one to mention this challenge, and he said that Bailey was drunk during the negotiation. This change does not appear in the council minutes, so it's not clear if anything was changed. I mention it though because this article is the one that deals with quit rents, which were an extremely fraught topic for the Black Loyalists in Sierra Leone. The fact that the Maroons refused to sign the agreement meant that the Sierra Leone Company and Council had no proof, other than verbal proof, that the Maroons had agreed to the quit rent proposed. Their refusal opened the door for future disagreements over quit rent payments, which began occurring in 1801. Third, the Maroons asked that the reference to public works in Article 8 be stricken from the agreement, and the Council agreed to change the 8th article and refer instead to the public good or the good of the settlement. In the 4th alteration that the Maroons made, they changed the 7th article's wording about the 3 months of provisions they would receive. Ross explained that he had told them, quote, that the governor and council would never entirely cut off their allowance, except in 2 instances, when, quote, there was some previous fault on the Maroons' part, and when the governor and council, quote, could first point out to them the manner in which they could support themselves. The Maroons obtained a promise from the governor that unless the Maroons were guilty of some fault, as for instance neglecting to clear and cultivate their lands, the necessary supply of provision should be continued to them till they could maintain themselves, though that period would not exceed 12 months. They pressed for a definition of fault and for an extension of the provisioning period. Once the council agreed, quote, to an extension of the 7th article and thus the terms of their engagement, the Maroons, quote, unanimously accepted the council's request for help. It had taken 48 hours for them to agree to deal with the Black Loyalists. The 1800 agreement has likely been missed because of the original text of the articles and the fact that they're housed in a different collection than the council minutes documenting the negotiations and adjustments made to it. The text of the articles are in the Colonial Office records in Kew. These were enclosed in a 1799 letter to England's Home Secretary, but renegotiated in Freetown, Sierra Leone, as recorded in an appendix to that year's council minutes, which described the Nova Scotian riot and arrival of the Maroons. It probably served the Sierra Leone Council and Company's interests to avoid drawing attention to the legal agreement because previous similar agreements had created problems between the colony's Black Loyalists or Nova Scotians. It probably also benefited white British officials to emphasize the Maroons' illiteracy because it allowed them to delegitimize Maroons' complaints. The council later recorded the Maroons' acceptance of the terms alongside Jarrett's acceptance on behalf of all the other Maroons as their representative. the need to confirm acceptance of the terms in Nova Scotia and again in Sierra Leone, the need to confirm that the terms had been previously accepted, the similarities between these terms and the articles of the 1738-39 Leeward and Windward treaties, the Council's belated recognition of the document as public, the Maroons' comparison of it to the 1796 treaty, and the fact that the Maroons in 1800 refused to sign the Articles of Agreement all lend weight to the argument that this was a formal agreement in practice, if not in name. In following Dallas's example and missing the Maroons' food politics, scholars have underemphasized a significant negotiation in 1800 between the Maroons and the Sierra Leone councilmen. The Maroons did not immediately agree to help the Sierra Leone Council. They first requested and secured changes to the terms of their resettlement. This presentation shows that the terms were similar in a number of ways to the treaties of the First Maroon War, and further that the terms the Maroons renegotiated were likely informed by the food insecurity that they experienced during the Second Maroon War in Jamaica and during their 4 years in Nova Scotia. Interpreting the 1800 agreement as a fourth treaty not only builds on recent work on Maroon agency, collaboration, and survival, but also suggests the extent to which negotiations over resettlement informed broader discussions about the political rights of people of African descent in the Atlantic world, as they made decisions about their own bodies and claimed broader legal rights. Thank you.